September 1919, Munich, Germany. A 30-year-old failed artist sits in a beer hall, unemployed, forgotten, living in a military barracks because he has nowhere else to go. His name is Adolf Hitler, and at this moment he is absolutely nobody. No money, no prospects, no future. Just another broken veteran in a broken nation, invisible among millions of other invisible men. But in exactly 14 years, this same man will command the loyalty of 80 million Germans. He will rebuild a shattered economy. He will create the largest military machine Europe has ever seen, and he will lead his nation into the most devastating war in human history. The question that has haunted historians for decades is simple, yet terrifying. How? How does a homeless nobody with no political experience, no wealth, no connections, and no education transform into the most powerful dictator of the 20th century? The answer lies in a single moment, a single phrase, spoken on a September evening in 1919 in a room of 43 people who had no idea they were witnessing the birth of a monster. This is not a story about evil genius. This is not a story about destiny or fate. This is a story about the most dangerous discovery a broken man can make, the realization that words, when spoken with absolute conviction, can bypass reason entirely and speak directly to the darkest parts of the human soul. Let me take you back to the Germany that created Hitler, because to understand how he rose, you first need to understand how far Germany had fallen. November 1918. World War I ends. Germany has lost. But this isn't just a military defeat. This is total, absolute, humiliating collapse. 4 years of industrial slaughter have left 2 million German soldiers dead. The economy is in ruins. Inflation is beginning its spiral into madness. The Kaiser has fled. The government has surrendered. And worst of all, for many Germans, their nation has been stabbed in the back by politicians who signed the armistice while German troops still stood on foreign soil. The Treaty of Versailles arrives like a death sentence. Germany must accept full blame for the war, must pay impossible reparations, must surrender territory, must disarm almost completely. The proud German Empire, which had been the most powerful nation in Europe just 5 years earlier, is now reduced to a broken, humiliated shadow of itself. But here's what most people don't understand about trauma on a national scale. It doesn't create unity. It creates rage. It creates the desperate need to find someone to blame. And in Germany, in 1919, everyone is looking for someone to blame. The communists blame the capitalists. The capitalists blame the communists. The military blames the politicians blame the military, the Catholics blame the Protestants, the conservatives blame the liberals, and everyone, absolutely everyone, is starting to blame the Jews. This is the world Adolf Hitler returns to after 4 years of war, and he is drowning in it. Hitler's life up to this point has been a series of catastrophic failures. He wanted to be an artist, rejected from art school, twice. He wanted to be an architect, no formal education, no credentials, no path forward. He drifted to Vienna selling postcards and paintings of buildings for spare change, sleeping in homeless shelters, eating at charity kitchens. Then the war came, and for 4 years he finally found purpose as a dispatch runner on the Western Front. He was good at it. Brave, even. He won medals. He found belonging in the trenches. He found meaning in the violence. And then Germany lost, and that meaning evaporated. That belonging vanished, and Hitler was right back where he started, nobody, with nothing, going nowhere. Except now, something inside him has broken in a different way. The humiliation of defeat has fused with his personal failures into a toxic, radioactive core of resentment. He doesn't just hate his own poverty. He doesn't just hate his own insignificance. He hates the world that made him insignificant. And he's starting to develop a theory about who is responsible. September 12, 1919. The German army, desperate to monitor the explosion of radical political groups in Munich, sends Hitler to observe a meeting of something called the German Workers' Party. It's not even really a party. It's 43 people in a beer hall, led by a locksmith named Anton Drexler, talking about nationalism and socialism and conspiracy theories. Hitler is supposed to just watch, take notes, report back. He sits in the back, bored, unimpressed, ready to leave. This is just another irrelevant group of angry men shouting into the void. He's seen dozens of these. They never amount to anything. But then, something happens. Another attendee starts arguing for Bavaria to break away from Germany, and something inside Hitler ignites. He stands up, and he starts talking, and everyone in the room stops and listens, because the voice coming out of this thin, pale, unremarkable man is not the voice of a nobody. It's the voice of something else entirely. It's sharp, it's angry, it's hypnotic. It cuts through the room like a blade. He speaks for 15 minutes, destroys the man's argument, sits back down. The room is silent. And Anton Drexler, the founder of this tiny, irrelevant party, leans over to another member and says something that will change the course of history. This man, we need this man. 3 days later, Hitler receives a postcard inviting him to join the German Workers' Party. He almost throws it away. He doesn't want to join another pointless political group. But something pulls him back. Curiosity, maybe. Boredom. Desperation. He goes to the next meeting, and then the next, and then they ask him to speak publicly. And that's when Adolf Hitler discovers the weapon that will make him unstoppable. He discovers that he can make people feel what he feels, not through logic, not through reason, but through raw, unfiltered emotion channeled directly from his rage into theirs. He discovers that when he speaks, something alchemical happens. His personal resentment becomes their collective purpose. His hatred becomes their clarity. His anger becomes their strength. This is the moment everything changes, not because Hitler is special, but because he has stumbled onto the most dangerous psychological weapon in human history, the ability to transform a crowd's fear and humiliation into a single, focused, unstoppable force. And the phrase that unlocks this power is deceptively simple, devastatingly effective. And it will echo through history as the foundation of every totalitarian movement that follows. The phrase is not complicated. It's not clever. It doesn't require education or intelligence to understand. That's exactly why it works. That's exactly why it's so dangerous. Because what Hitler discovered that night, and what he will refine over the next 14 years into the most powerful propaganda machine the world has ever seen, is this. People don't want complex answers to their suffering. They want simple ones. They don't want nuance. They want certainty. They don't want to examine their own failures. They want someone else to blame, and Hitler is about to give them exactly that. Let me be very clear about something. Adolf Hitler was not born a great speaker. The man who would eventually command audiences of hundreds of thousands, who would mesmerize an entire nation, who would make millions of educated, rational people abandon their moral compass and follow him into darkness. This man started out as awkward, nervous, and completely forgettable. His early speeches were disasters. He would ramble, lose his train of thought. His voice would crack. He would gesture too much or not at all. The first time he spoke to a crowd of more than 100 people in November 1919, he was terrified. His hands shook. His notes were a mess. By all accounts, it should have been a humiliating failure. But something else happened. Something unexpected. Because even though his delivery was rough, even though his organization was chaotic, even though he violated every rule of public speaking, people listened. And more importantly, people felt something. They felt anger. They felt purpose. They felt like someone finally understood their rage. Hitler noticed this, and unlike every other failed speaker who blames the audience or gives up, Hitler became obsessed with understanding why it worked. He started studying himself, analyzing every speech, taking notes on what made people react. He experimented with different techniques, different rhythms, different emotional crescendos. He turned public speaking into a science, a weapon, an art form dedicated to a single purpose, the complete psychological domination of his audience. And over the next 2 years, from 1919 to 1921, he refined his approach into something genuinely terrifying. He discovered the formula, and at the center of that formula was one core principle, expressed in dozens of variations, but always coming back to the same fundamental message, the phrase that changed everything. Here's how it worked. First, Hitler would establish common suffering. He would spend the opening minutes of every speech describing, in vivid, emotional detail, the pain everyone in the room was feeling, the humiliation of defeat, the poverty, the unemployment, the sense that Germany had been destroyed by forces beyond their control. He would make them relive it, feel it. until the entire room was vibrating with shared misery. This wasn't just description, this was emotional orchestration. He would modulate his voice from quiet, almost intimate whispers to gradually building intensity. He would pause at exactly the right moments, letting the silence amplify the weight of what he'd just said. He would use repetition, hammering certain phrases over and over until they became hypnotic mantras. We have been betrayed. We have been humiliated. We have been destroyed. And just when the audience was drowning in despair, just when the emotional weight had become almost unbearable, Hitler would do something brilliant. He would give them permission to stop blaming themselves. Because here's what Hitler understood about human psychology. People who are suffering want to believe it's not their fault. They desperately want to believe that their pain has been inflicted on them by someone else. Because if it's someone else's fault, then they are victims, not failures. If it's someone else's fault, then they have an enemy to fight, not a personal inadequacy to face. If it's someone else's fault, then there's a solution. Destroy the enemy, and the pain will stop. This is the core of the phrase, the fundamental message that Hitler would repeat in 1,000 different forms for the next 25 years. Your suffering is not your fault. It has been done to you, and I know who did it. That's it. That's the phrase. Not word for word, but conceptually, that's the weapon. And it's more powerful than any bomb, any army, any rational argument, because it speaks directly to the part of the human brain that craves simple explanations for complex suffering. Now you might be thinking, that's not a particularly original insight. Lots of politicians blame external enemies. Lots of movements scapegoat outsiders. What made Hitler different? What made Hitler different was the totality of his conviction. When Hitler spoke, he wasn't performing. He wasn't calculating. He genuinely, completely, absolutely believed what he was saying. His rage was real. His certainty was unshakable. And that authenticity, that complete lack of doubt, was intoxicating to people drowning in uncertainty. Think about it from the perspective of a German worker in 1920. Your country has collapsed. Your savings are worthless. You fought in the war, watched your friends die, came home to unemployment and contempt. The government seems weak and corrupt. The economy is getting worse every day. Communists and reactionaries are literally fighting street battles in your city. Nothing makes sense. Nothing feels stable. You are terrified and angry and helpless. And then you hear this man speak, and he is not uncertain. He is not confused. He is absolutely, completely sure about what happened and why. He tells you, this is not complex. This is not your fault. You are a victim of a conspiracy. The international bankers, the Marxists, the November criminals who stabbed Germany in the back, the Jewish influence corrupting German culture and economy, they did this to you. They orchestrated your suffering. And if we remove them, Germany will be great again. Do you see how seductive that is? Do you see how much easier that is to accept than the truth? Because the truth is complicated. The truth is that Germany lost the war because it was outmatched. The truth is that the economy is collapsing because of complex geopolitical and economic forces. The truth is that your personal suffering is the result of massive historical currents that no single group controls and no simple solution can fix. But Hitler's version? Hitler's version is simple, clear, and it gives you something the truth never can. An enemy you can fight, a purpose, a belonging, a way to transform your helplessness into power. By 1921, Hitler had completely taken over the German Workers' Party, renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, and was speaking to crowds of thousands. His reputation was growing, not because he was offering complex policy solutions, not because he had a detailed economic plan, but because he had mastered the dark art of transforming collective trauma into collective rage, and focusing that rage on a target. The phrase, the message, the psychological formula, it was working, and it was about to get much, much more sophisticated. Because Hitler was learning something else, something even more dangerous. He was learning that once you convince people their suffering is caused by an external enemy, they will not just follow you, they will love you, they will worship you, they will give you complete control over their lives, their morality, their very sense of reality, because you have given them something more valuable than truth. You have given them certainty, purpose, and permission to hate. In 1923, Hitler felt confident enough to attempt a coup, the Beer Hall Putsch. It failed spectacularly. He was arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Most political movements would have died there. Most leaders would have faded into obscurity. But Hitler spent his time in prison doing something crucial. He wrote down his philosophy. Mein Kampf. And while the book is rambling, poorly organized, and often incoherent, it contains, in written form, the exact psychological formula he'd been refining through speech. The message is there, repeated over and over. Germany's suffering is not Germany's fault. It has been inflicted by external parasites. Remove the parasites, purify the nation, and greatness will return. He served only 9 months, and when he was released, he discovered something remarkable. His message had spread. His reputation had grown. His phrase, his formula, his psychological weapon, it was becoming the rallying cry of a movement. And Germany, sinking deeper into economic chaos and political instability, was becoming more and more receptive to simple answers. The weapon was ready. The nation was vulnerable, and Adolf Hitler was about to deploy the phrase that would conquer a civilization. The moment that truly transformed Hitler from fringe agitator to legitimate political force came in 1930 during the depths of the Great Depression. But to understand why that moment was so critical, you need to understand something about the psychology of civilizational collapse. Between 1929 and 1932, Germany didn't just experience economic hardship, it experienced psychological disintegration. The unemployment rate hit 30%, 6 million Germans out of work. Life savings evaporated. The middle class, the educated, the respectable, the people who had done everything right, suddenly found themselves standing in bread lines next to the laborers and the homeless they used to look down on. The Weimar Republic, Germany's democratic government, seemed utterly incapable of solving anything. Paralyzed by coalition politics and constitutional gridlock, the government collapsed and reformed over and over, each new administration more impotent than the last. And here's the critical psychological shift. When a society's institutions fail this completely, people stop believing in incremental solutions. They stop trusting experts. They stop caring about constitutional norms or democratic processes. They become desperate for anyone who seems absolutely certain about what needs to be done. They become willing to trade freedom for stability, nuance for clarity, democracy for strength. This is the environment Hitler had been waiting for, because his message, his phrase, his psychological weapon, it was built precisely for this moment. He had spent 10 years refining a formula that transformed fear into rage, and rage into purpose. And now, finally, an entire nation was ready to hear it. The 1930 election was the breakthrough. The Nazi Party went from 12 seats in the Reichstag to 107, second largest party in Germany. And this wasn't just the uneducated or the fringe. Hitler was winning support from lawyers, doctors, teachers, shopkeepers, the middle-class professionals who saw their world collapsing and were desperate for someone to make it stop. But here's what's crucial to understand. Hitler didn't win by offering a detailed economic policy. He didn't win by presenting a sophisticated constitutional reform plan. He won by doing something much more primitive and much more powerful. He won by making people feel like their suffering made sense, like there was a reason for their pain, like there was someone to blame, and like he, and only he, had the strength to make the enemy pay. Every speech followed the same psychological architecture, the same formula, the same core message, delivered with 1,000 variations. He would start with validation. You are suffering. Your pain is real. Your anger is justified. This creates emotional resonance. The audience feels seen, heard, understood. Then absolution. This is not your fault. You did nothing wrong. You are victims of a conspiracy. This removes shame, removes personal responsibility, transforms individual failure into collective victimhood. Then identification. I know who did this to you, the Marxists, the bankers, the parasites who profit from your misery, the November criminals who stabbed Germany in the back, the international forces corrupting our nation from within. This provides a target, a focus for all that rage. Then empowerment. But we are not weak. We are Germans. We are strong. We have been betrayed, but we will rise again. We will take back what is ours. We will purify our nation. We will make Germany great again. This transforms victimhood into power, despair into purpose, and finally the demand for loyalty. But only if we act together, only if we are unified, only if we follow one leader, one vision, one will. Division made us weak. Unity will make us unstoppable. Do you see how sophisticated this is? Do you see how every element builds on the previous one, creating a psychological journey from despair to empowerment, from confusion to certainty, from individuality to collective identity? This is not just rhetoric. This is psychological engineering. This is the deliberate manipulation of human cognitive biases, the need for simple explanations, the tendency to blame external forces for personal suffering, the comfort of collective identity, the intoxication of righteous anger, the seduction of certainty in times of chaos. And it was working. By 1932, the Nazi Party was the largest party in Germany. In the July election, they won 37% of the vote, 230 seats. Hitler was now impossible to ignore. The conservative establishment, the traditional political parties, they all made the same catastrophic miscalculation. They thought they could control him. They thought they could use his popular support while keeping him contained. They thought he was just another politician who could be managed through normal political mechanisms. They were wrong. January 30th, 1933. President Hindenburg, pressured by conservative politicians who believe they can manipulate Hitler into serving their interests, appoints Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. The establishment celebrates. They think they've won. They've brought the Nazis into the government, given Hitler a prestigious title, but surrounded him with traditional conservatives who will keep him in check. They think this is clever politics. They have no idea what they've just done. Because the moment Hitler has legitimate power, everything changes. The phrase, the message, the psychological weapon he's been refining for 14 years, it's no longer just speech. It's now government policy. It's now law. It's now enforced by police and paramilitary forces and eventually by the full apparatus of a totalitarian state. Within weeks, Hitler uses a convenient crisis, the Reichstag fire, to convince Hindenburg to sign an emergency decree suspending civil liberties. Within months, he pushes through the Enabling Act, giving himself the power to pass laws without parliamentary approval. Within a year, all other political parties are banned. Within 2 years, Hindenburg dies and Hitler merges the presidency with the chancellorship, making himself Führer, absolute leader. And here's the thing that should terrify you. None of this was a secret conspiracy. Hitler did it all in public. He told everyone exactly what he was going to do. He wrote it in Mein Kampf. He said it in thousands of speeches. He never hid his intentions. The German people voted for it. The establishment enabled it. Because the phrase, the message, the psychological formula, it had done its work. It had convinced millions of people that their suffering was not their fault, that external enemies were destroying their nation, and that only absolute power in the hands of one certain, strong, uncompromising leader could save them. The weapon didn't just conquer Germany, it transformed Germany into a weapon itself. Everything Hitler had said for 14 years, every promise to purify the nation, every identification of internal enemies, every call for unity through the elimination of the other, it was all about to become policy. The propaganda became law, the rhetoric became genocide, the phrase became the Holocaust. And it all started with that one fundamental psychological insight, that one devastatingly simple message that bypassed reason and spoke directly to trauma. Your suffering is not your fault. It has been done to you, and I know who did it. 14 years, from a nobody in a room of 43 people to absolute dictator of the most powerful industrial nation in Europe. Not through military genius, not through economic expertise, not through political sophistication, but through the mastery of a single psychological weapon, the ability to transform a nation's suffering into a nation's rage and to focus that rage on a target. This is how Hitler rose. This is the moment Germany fell. And this is why we need to understand exactly what happened. Because the weapon still exists, the psychological formula still works, and the conditions that made Germany vulnerable in 1933 are not as far away as we'd like to believe. Once Hitler had absolute power, something truly horrifying happened. The phrase, the message, the psychological formula, it didn't stop. It metastasized. It evolved from a tool for gaining power into a system for maintaining total control over an entire population's perception of reality. This is where Hitler's psychological weapon transformed from propaganda into something far more sinister, a self-sustaining machinery of mass delusion. The first thing Hitler did, immediately upon consolidating power, was weaponize the phrase through repetition at a scale never before attempted in human history. Joseph Goebbels, appointed as Minister of Propaganda and Public Enlightenment in 1933, understood something profound about human psychology. A lie repeated often enough, from enough sources with enough apparent authority, doesn't just persuade people. It rewrites their perception of what's true. Think about how this worked in practice. Every newspaper, controlled or censored, every radio broadcast, scripted or monitored, every film approved by the state, every school curriculum rewritten, every public space plastered with posters, every rally choreographed for maximum emotional impact. And all of it, every single piece of content, reinforcing the same core message. Your suffering was caused by enemies within and without. Your strength comes from racial purity and national unity. Your salvation requires absolute loyalty to the Führer. This wasn't just propaganda. This was the systematic elimination of alternative realities. If you were a German citizen in 1935, you could not escape the message. You woke up to it on the radio. You saw it on posters on your way to work. Your children learned it in school. Your colleagues discussed it at lunch. You heard it in speeches broadcast from loudspeakers in public squares. You watched it in newsreels before movies. It was everywhere, all the time, reinforced by everyone around you, until it became not just a message you heard, but the fundamental architecture of how you understood the world. But here's where it gets even more psychologically sophisticated. Hitler and Goebbels understood that people don't fully believe propaganda just from hearing it. They believe it from seeing others believe it. They believe it from acting on it themselves. They believe it from the social pressure of conformity. So the Nazi regime didn't just broadcast the message, they forced people to participate in it. You want to keep your job? You need to join the party organizations. You want your children to succeed? They need to join the Hitler Youth. You want to avoid suspicion? You need to attend the rallies, give the salutes, inform on your neighbors who don't show sufficient enthusiasm. Every act of participation, no matter how small, created psychological investment. Every time you repeated the slogans, even if you didn't believe them at first, you reinforced them in your own mind. Every time you informed on someone, you justified it by believing they must be an enemy. Every time you stayed silent while others were taken away, you convinced yourself they must have deserved it, because the alternative, that you were complicit in evil, was too painful to accept. This is the true genius of totalitarian manipulation. It doesn't just change what people think, it changes what people are willing to think. It makes certain thoughts socially impossible. It makes questioning the core message not just dangerous but psychologically unbearable, because questioning the message means questioning your own participation in the system, which means confronting your own complicity, which means admitting you might be the villain in your own story. And the phrase, the core message, it kept evolving to maintain its power. In the early years, it was about economic recovery. The Jews and the Marxists destroyed our economy. We are rebuilding German strength. And it worked. Unemployment dropped. Infrastructure projects created jobs. The German people, desperate for stability, saw the economic improvement and accepted the premise that Hitler's identification of enemies had been correct. Then, as the economy stabilized, the message shifted. Germany has been surrounded by hostile nations who fear our strength. We must expand to protect ourselves. We must reclaim what was stolen from us. And the German people, now invested in the narrative of victimhood and revival, accepted the logic of aggressive expansion. Austria, the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, each conquest presented as defensive, as reclaiming what rightfully belonged to Germany, as protecting Germans from foreign threats. And then, as war became inevitable, the message evolved again. The Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy is trying to destroy Germany from within, while enemies attack from without. Only total commitment, total sacrifice, total obedience can save us now. And the German people, now fully trapped in the narrative, now psychologically unable to question the fundamental premise without questioning everything they'd believed and done for years, accepted even this. Accepted the Holocaust. Accepted total war. accepted the deaths of millions, because to reject the message now would be to admit they'd been wrong from the beginning, and that was psychologically impossible. This is why intelligent people followed Hitler. This is why educated people committed atrocities. This is why ordinary Germans participated in genocide. Not because they were inherently evil, not because Germans are somehow fundamentally different from other humans, but because they had been slowly, systematically, relentlessly shaped by a psychological system that made evil feel like righteousness, that made cruelty feel like self-defense, that made mass murder feel like salvation. The phrase had done its work. It had transformed a nation's understanding of reality itself, and by the time the full horror of what they'd participated in became undeniable, it was too late. Millions were dead. Europe was in ruins, and Germany itself was about to be destroyed by the very logic Hitler had unleashed, the idea that strength justifies everything, that enemies must be eliminated, that might makes right. The machinery of mass manipulation, built on a single simple phrase, had consumed the nation that created it. May 8, 1945. Germany surrenders. Hitler is dead. Suicide in a bunker as Soviet forces close in. The Third Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, has collapsed after 12. 60 million people are dead. The Holocaust has murdered 6 million Jews and millions of others. Europe is a smoking ruin, and the world is left with a question that still haunts us today. How did this happen? How did one man, using essentially just words, transform an advanced, educated, civilized nation into a genocidal machine? The answer, as we've traced through this story, is not complicated. It's actually terrifyingly simple. Hitler succeeded because he discovered and refined a psychological formula that exploits fundamental vulnerabilities in human cognition and social behavior. A formula that can be summarized in a single phrase: your suffering is not your fault. It has been done to you by identifiable enemies, and I alone have the strength to save you. This formula works because it addresses three primal human needs that become overwhelming during times of crisis. First, the need for simple explanations. When life becomes chaotic and painful, when the world stops making sense, people desperately crave clarity. They want to understand why they're suffering, and a simple, emotionally satisfying explanation, even if it's false, is more psychologically comforting than a complex, ambiguous truth. Second, the need to externalize blame. People resist accepting that their suffering might be the result of impersonal forces, historical accidents, or their own choices. It's much more bearable to believe that suffering has been inflicted by a malicious other who can be identified, confronted, and defeated. Third, the need for belonging and purpose. Especially in times of chaos, people crave membership in something larger than themselves. They want to be part of a narrative that makes them heroes rather than victims, that gives their suffering meaning, that transforms their pain into purpose. Hitler's genius, if we can even use that word for something so destructive, was recognizing that these needs are not rational. They're emotional, and they can be activated, amplified, and directed through carefully crafted rhetoric that bypasses critical thinking entirely and speaks directly to the parts of the brain that crave certainty, clarity, and belonging. But here's the truly disturbing part. This formula still works. The psychological vulnerabilities it exploits haven't changed. Human cognition in 2024 is the same as human cognition in 1933. We still crave simple explanations for complex problems. We still prefer to externalize blame rather than confront difficult truths. We still seek belonging in tribal identities. We are still susceptible to leaders who offer certainty in times of uncertainty, who identify enemies to focus our rage, who promise to make us great again if we just give them power and stop questioning. Every authoritarian movement since Hitler has used variations of the same formula. Stalin: your suffering is caused by class enemies and foreign saboteurs. Mao: your suffering is caused by landlords and counter-revolutionaries. Pol Pot: your suffering is caused by intellectuals and urban elites. Milosevic: your suffering is caused by ethnic enemies. Every single totalitarian regime, regardless of ideology, regardless of context, uses the same psychological weapon: identify suffering, externalize blame, demand absolute loyalty. And here's what should terrify you. The conditions that made Germany vulnerable in 1933 are not unique to that time or place. economic instability, political polarization, institutional failure, social fragmentation, the sense that traditional authorities have lost credibility, these conditions recur throughout history. And when they do, populations become vulnerable to exactly the kind of psychological manipulation Hitler mastered. We see echoes of the formula today in every populist movement, left or right, that offers simple enemies to explain complex problems. We see it in conspiracy theories that give people clarity and purpose by identifying malicious others controlling events from the shadows. We see it in social media algorithms that amplify outrage and tribal identity because engagement is profitable. We see it in political rhetoric that divides the world into us versus them, that presents every issue as existential, that demands loyalty over truth. The machinery has changed, the technology is different, but the fundamental psychological weapon remains the same. And it still works. So what's the defense? How do we protect ourselves and our societies from this kind of manipulation? The answer is not comfortable, because the defense requires something very difficult, the willingness to sit with complexity, uncertainty, and ambiguity. It requires resisting the temptation of simple explanations. It requires accepting that some suffering is not anyone's fault, that some problems don't have villains, that some challenges require cooperation rather than the elimination of enemies. It requires intellectual humility, emotional resilience, and the constant vigilance against our own cognitive biases. It requires us to recognize when we're being offered the phrase in new forms, when a leader tells you that your suffering is not your fault, that it's been inflicted by identifiable enemies, that they alone can fix it if you just give them power and stop questioning them. You need to recognize what's happening. You're being offered the same formula that Hitler used, maybe with different enemies, different justifications, different aesthetic presentation, but the same fundamental psychological manipulation. And here's the crucial test. If a leader's primary message is about who to blame rather than how to solve problems together, if they demand absolute loyalty rather than encouraging critical thinking, if they present themselves as uniquely capable of salvation rather than as one voice among many, if they treat complexity as conspiracy and disagreement as betrayal, then you are dealing with someone using Hitler's playbook. The lesson of Hitler's rise is not that Germans were uniquely evil, it's that humans are universally vulnerable. The lesson is not that fascism is a thing of the past, it's that the psychological mechanisms that enable authoritarianism are permanent features of human psychology. The lesson is not that we need to worry about someone exactly like Hitler using exactly his methods. It's that we need to recognize the formula in whatever form it takes, whoever uses it, whatever enemies they identify. Because the phrase that transformed Hitler from a homeless nobody into absolute dictator, that phrase still works. The formula that transformed Germany from a democracy into a genocidal totalitarian state, that formula is still operational. The psychological weapon that killed 60 million people, that weapon still exists. And the only defense is understanding. Understanding how it works, understanding why it works, understanding when you're being subjected to it, understanding the difference between legitimate grievance and manipulated rage. Understanding that leaders who offer simple answers to complex problems, who demand you stop thinking and start obeying, who promise salvation through the elimination of identified enemies, these leaders are offering you the same poison that Hitler offered Germany. 14 years. That's how long it took for Hitler to go from nobody to dictator, from a failed artist in a beer hall to the most powerful man in Europe, from speaking to 43 people to commanding 80 million, not through supernatural ability, not through historical inevitability, but through the careful, systematic exploitation of human psychological vulnerabilities using a devastatingly simple message. Your suffering is not your fault. It has been done to you, and I know who did it. That's the phrase, that's the weapon, that's the warning, and now you know how it works, which